Right. Good afternoon or good day or good morning, depending on wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to today's SAAL Structured Conversation. This session is being recorded and closed captions are available in the bottom right corner of your Zoom toolbar. My name is Tori. I'm a Senior Program Review and Strategy Consultant at Ohio State. On behalf of SAAL's Professional Learning and Development Committee, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Marianne here is also helping me facilitate today, so you may see her jump into the chat and into the conversation at various points. So SAL and our committee really want to get a diversity of perspectives and identities in our offerings to make sure we're meeting everyone's professional development needs. To that purpose, we do have a proposal on our website if you wanted to submit for a future SAL structured conversation, as well as some future SAL structured conversations already scheduled for November and December. In November, we'll be talking about the Accelerate principles, and then in December, we will have a conversation about data lakes and operational needs. During this presentation, we are going to have a designated Q&A section at the end. However, you're welcome to pop in your questions throughout in the chat, and we will give everyone an opportunity to unmute themselves and have more of a conversation when we get to the Q&A portion. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer things over to Ania, who's going to lead us in our presentation today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We're going to have more of an informal presentation where we're going to start out with introductions, and then we're going to go and have a conversation followed by Q&A at the end. So I'll just start off and just give my first name. My name is Ania. I'm currently at the University of Kentucky, and I want to share actually before 4 or 5 years ago, I had no idea what a publication was. So I was nervous, I wasn't sure what to do, which is I think one of the reasons why me and my colleagues decided to do this presentation, because there might be other people in this room who also might be new to publishing, not sure where to start. So I'm going to turn it over to the person on my screen, Sophie, if you don't mind going next.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sophie Tullier. I am someone who loved to write as a child. I think I, remember writing a little fiction story in the 4th grade about an underwater tooth fairy or something. So I've always really enjoyed the act of writing, but the whole publishing aspect was very sort of out of reach as I got into sort of my professional life. And so as I've sort of learned a little bit more about this process, just excited to be here with my co-presenters, whoever wants to go next.
You want to take it, Shaun?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Shaun. I am at the University of Florida. I started down this journey studying animal behavior. Now I know that was my introverted way to understand humans. So I worked with dolphins and monkeys and all kinds of crazy things in this other chapter before finding student affairs. And I worked in recreation for many years. And then when I told my recreation colleagues that I was shifting to some assessment work, they were kind of like, yeah, we could have told you that was a good fit for you a long time ago. You're a nerdy research kind of person. So it's been good to learn more about that in this chapter of my life, and a pleasure to be with this company today. Heather, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, my name is Heather Strine-Patterson. Maybe if you're kind of telling, we're not introducing ourselves in a kind of normal, traditional way with like institution and position and degree. And maybe that was a little bit of me. I'm hoping that there's some people in this space wondering about publication and might feel a little bit of imposter syndrome with it all. I was a first generation college student, and to be honest, like this has kind of been coming out as of late as my kids are in elementary school and struggling with reading and writing. And so I didn't have and don't have great self-efficacy with reading or writing. And so it's very bizarre to then be somebody that is in this world in my professional career. I remember being in my master's program at Syracuse University, and Vince Tinto told me that like my writing was a little strange. And so I've worked a lot on my writing, but it's something that's not been, I did not enjoy writing or reading as a kid, like Sophie. So admire those people that do, but wanted to be transparent, like that, a lot of us have struggled or had things that we've overcome to write to get here. So wanted to kind of take down all the degrees and like introduce ourselves as humans.
All right, so we're going to flow next to dispelling myths. I feel like there's a lot of myths out there, so we just want to take a few minutes to dispel things that might be present in your thoughts, or maybe people we've talked to about writing as well. I think the first one I want to talk about is that anybody can write regardless of educational background. You do not need a specialized degree, you do not need writing courses, and the thing that might also come up is you need a doctorate, and that's absolutely not true. You can have any background and basically write as long as you're proficient in the subject, interested, and sometimes need a bit of guidance as well.
Another thing is that often we can think like when we write, kind of dispelling the myths we hear. I don't know, I used to hear, and that made me more intimidated, like, gosh, reviewers are so critical, and that they're there to kind of grade you. And I was like, I've really struggled with writing and being graded. And so that felt really intimidating to me as a writer, but learned it was really a myth, and that the editors and reviewers of articles or chapters or whatever you're doing are really there to support you and help strengthen your idea, and help you strengthen your writing so that by the time it's published and it gets to an audience, that it's a better piece through that process. And so it's the flip from the grading, and it can be a really supportive environment.
And kind of bouncing off Heather as well, when I at least started to publish a few years back, I first thought I had to go to those top tier journals. They can take a very long time to prepare for. You need very specific content. You don't need to publish in there, as we're going to be sharing during our session. And I'm sure if you want to during the Q&A, we can discuss this as well. There's a variety of places you can publish. You can do blogs, book chapters, and other avenues as well. So I just want to encourage everyone as we're continuing our conversation to think that there's multiple avenues to publish as well.
I just want to add to that where I started, a lot of the journals were the trade journals, the ones out in the professional associations. They weren't those research journals. It was where people like me doing student affairs work read. And a lot of those journals are double blind, so they don't know your name or title or institution or degrees. They just know the quality of your work, which is a nice approach that you really don't have to rest on those titles.
Transitioning to the next topic, it's important to talk about why write in the first place. I think something that came up, at least in my experience, was the idea that it's important to just get your name out there. But I actually see writing in a variety of forms as a way of professional development. And the fact is, you can start to learn about a topic, you can go and write about it, but as you write about it, you get more familiar, you can share your results in conferences as well as publications. So you kind of get personal development and develop yourself as a professional when you're writing in many different forms.
I know one of the things Heather and I have talked about a lot is writing as therapy. Um, and sort of like one of the things that I have really enjoyed about writing recently is kind of similar to how I approach journaling. Like, I'm not really even sure what my own mind thinks until I write it down. And just sort of going through that and iterative process and thinking about all the different things I've read and how do they connect and exploring those connections. I've really clarified for myself what I think about our work, my role, and various different topics in higher ed, but that's been really, really helpful for me.
We're doing the pause, see who unpauses first, Heather and I. I was thinking of our board of trustees recently and some other key constituents that have really responded well to some work that we have already done, and it wasn't that much more work to publish, but they just go, "Oh, you published. I can see that on a journal's website," and it lends some weight to the work that we already did.
Yeah, I feel like used to get advice a lot to present, and that was the thing in student affairs, and that student affairs practitioners should do is present. And that is a great way to think about sharing. As I've gotten kind of older, I've realized that writing, I got some great advice that write and then present. And at first I was like, why do that? Like I kind of present and then write. But I think that writing and then getting those thoughts out and then working on a presentation helps me go back and strengthen the writing, right? So then I think I refine it a little bit more. I also think like writing is long-standing. I've talked about, I think with all these folks in this space, presentations used to get cited a lot more, right? Like this person did this presentation. You don't see that as much. I do wish we'd kind of go back to that, but we also don't have, access maybe to those, the slides that somebody might share or those resources. And so writing really puts it in a way that you can refer people to it when they have questions or share that information. And then writing really puts it out there that you can, the next person can write and strengthen it or refute it. And I don't tend to see that kind of engagement when it's slides or a presentation that somebody's doing. So I think there's like a way that writing why it's important to write is that it can help push our thinking. It can help push our generalizable knowledge. I think we think a lot about that with research, but we don't always think about how in our work it can push how we're thinking about our work and how we're approaching our work. And then if we write about it, then somebody else can write about it and we can really continue engaging in deeper conversation and meaning making about how to do this work.
I think something else that can come up when we talk about writing is research and assessment. Where there is a little bit of overlap, there's some differences. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues to talk about some of the similarities and differences between the two areas.
I was captivated by the chat here. So I had a conversation with our IRB office years ago, and I remember learning about IRB as I heard it as a 4-letter word, the scary thing to approach IRB offices, ran into some barriers where I wasn't primarily a faculty role, and they're used to that pathway and getting the approvals to even be in an IRB. But had an interesting discussion with the IRB crew that I asked about presenting, and if that was generalizable knowledge, and like any good answer, they said it depends. And they said, if you go to a presentation with something you have learned and you present it as what you did at your school, your situation, up to the audience to decide if it transfers, that's not a claim of generalizable knowledge. But the same presentation, if you say, here are reasons to believe this would generalize to your school, then that is generalizable knowledge in their eyes and should go through an IRB process. So this isn't just about writing, to keep in mind the IRB process. So just this idea of generalizable knowledge. Also, just before I forget, that if an IRB tells you you're exempt, I learned the hard way long ago that this was not the same as you don't have to go through an IRB. It's a type of IRB that is exempt from a full committee review. But if you haven't heard of IRB, institutional review boards, it's just somebody else checking that your protocols meet some standards for protecting human subjects. And so that's something to think about with the generalizable knowledge research pathway.
Yeah, this is something I pay attention a lot to as an editor of the JSI. People will intermix in, like in their article, research and assessment. And in part, I think sometimes it's because we use both of those terms to refer to measurement. And so we're using them as synonyms for measurement. But when we do talk about, are we talking about generalizable knowledge? Are we talking about institutional improvement efforts and examples of institutional improvement efforts? Folks might say, like, in my research, and I'm comment, did you go through IRB? Is this research? Is this generalizable knowledge? Or they might say, this assessment. And I'm like, this kind of sounds like a dissertation that you wrote, which probably was intended to be generalizable and you went through IRB. And so I think there are some ways we treat all of these kinds of words as synonyms. But there are lots of spaces and ways in which you can write that you don't need an IRB, like Shaun said. If you're doing something, and I had a similar conversation about like, we want black and white answers, but there's lots of shades of gray. But I've been coached at multiple institutions by the IRB board there that it's about your primary intent, you know? And so if your primary intent was, you know, continuous improvement efforts, an assessment project on your campus, and then you decide, hey, this is like a shareable example, whether it be in writing or a presentation later, maybe that wasn't your original intent even, then, you know, that's okay. But if your original intent is to share broadly, write, present as generalizable knowledge, then like Shaun said, you do want to go through the IRB process. And there will be places and journals that will, or places that you might try to publish then that want to see, okay, where's your IRB exemption or approval for your study that you're sharing.
So I hope this encourages everyone to know that when you publish, it does not mean you need to go through IRB. There's a lot of options out there. So what Shaun, Heather are saying are great to consider. And it kind of goes to the final thing we want to talk about in this section, which is I'm not ready to write. And there can be many reasons why you're not ready to write. It could be an issue of time. Maybe it's an issue of self-efficacy or not feeling prepared. But writing is doable. So I want to open it up to my colleagues to talk about some strategies they do to fit in their schedule or getting ready to write.
I know my brain is most clear and reflective at about 5 a.m. So that is when I try to, you know, make sure the kids are asleep, make sure I get an hour or two to write something down and sort of process it in my brain. But it's not going to work for me if I sit down and try to write at 11 a.m. There's nothing's going to come out. The email inbox is going to be there. Yeah.
Something that I do actually, because I also am very busy, is sometimes do 15-minute increments. Like Sophie, I tend to write early in the morning, but maybe I only have 30 minutes at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So trying to break up the writing to do different sections, different times could be helpful as well. But I'm sorry, Heather, you wanted to say something as well?
No, I think, yeah, I, even with what you just said, and then what Sophie said, I think it's knowing your brain and how you think and when you work well, right? Writing can be hard or easy. Like when I hear Ania, I'm like, oh, I couldn't just write for 15 minutes. And that's part of the problem sometimes because I can't just jump in, like my brain. I need to like turn everything else off and be focused. And there's also no way I'm waking up at 5 a.m. like Sophie to write. So both of those things don't work super well for me. And so like I find like, you know, blocking time on a Friday with a friend that's writing and creating like an accountability buddy to try to say, let's just write together and be in shared space. That's really helpful for me. Or I have a great partner that when I say, I want to go write, he's like, okay, go, like get to your office, get away from the house, get away from the kids. And I'm really fortunate to have that. But also like, I can want to write. I feel like this fall, actually, I've wanted to write and life has been really hard. You know, there's been a lot of balls and juggling all the things. And so trying to give yourself grace, I think, when you know, it does need to take a back burner. And that doesn't mean you don't pick it up later. But we're all leading busy and complicated lives. And this is one of the balls that you want to maybe add, but don't let it, you know, have you drop a glass ball, right? That will break.
Anya, I'm thinking back to how you started this myth of the I'm not ready. And I still feel that way. I think almost every article and start as my own skeptic trying to like was mentioned as therapy. But another way that it helped was to get started, especially was to find co-authors and the assistance and the joy of working together with somebody on something, maybe somebody that knows more about it, and I'm just able to be a little piece of the puzzle was a really nice entry into feeling more confident with writing.
All right, now that we discussed some myths and background, let's move on to the other topic, which is to provide work for publication. I think the most important thing is to figure out what do you want to write about. Example, if we're doing research, think of the research questions or the gap in knowledge, but there's other ways to frame that as well. So I'll turn over to my colleagues to discuss that important topic.
I think I'm starting with the research one, which maybe because that's the kind of default that people go to. We definitely want to point out that there are other avenues. And Heather mentioned this kind of Venn diagram that it can be more than one of these things. With research, I mentioned IRB earlier. So one thing is you cannot think it's an internal reporting process, and then you find something so amazing you decide to publish, and then you go to IRB and say, can you give me an IRB for this thing I already did? They will say, you're welcome to redo it after we approve it. And I've had to do that before. So if you have a chance to think about that possibility early, it is a good idea to do IRB first. And then it's also interesting that most people I've talked to experience the same thing, where you have an idea and then you wonder, hopefully, if it's been done before. And some of your first searches, you don't find anything. And not only do you find nothing where you're like, I think nobody's done this, you're like, I can't find anything on this like broad subject. Does it even exist? And what happens is you just don't have the right industry language. You have to learn the acronyms and the special terms. Once you do that, you will find too much. And then you're like, how do I narrow this down? And then most folks, if you're so fortunate, you find an article or two or three that in the discussion has limitations, and it says suggestions for future research. And the thing that they describe is what you want to do. And you will swear that it said your name. And I remember moments like that where you're like, this should be done, Shaun. And you push your chair back in this like aha moment. So that's a really important part of the process for the research approach, is that lit review and situating your topic in the body of literature. A gold mine is dissertations. Dissertations are not typically published in peer-reviewed journals, but they have really thorough lit reviews, right? They were reviewed by a group of faculty, so they're very thorough. Side note, you can make a lot of friends if you have, say, a VP who has their doctorate to actually read their dissertation and talk to them about it. They will love that. So that's a tip, to look at lit reviews, including, I've talked to a lot of folks that don't know about Google Scholar and that it has a reverse bibliography. I mean, dating myself, there was a section in the library that had reverse bibliographies, these like lime green books, and you looked up an article and it would tell you who cited that article since it came out. Now Google does that with one nice click under the article, so you can move forward in time and see the articles more recent that are on that same topic. So that comes to mind. And the last thing, of course, is if you're thinking of a journal, to look at that journal and look at the style, the flow, the type of content that's in those articles to give you an idea of what they're looking for.
I think as we think about, like, if that's sort of our frame of reference for everything, right? We're brought up through grad school. Our faculty do research in peer-reviewed journals, and that's what we know about. But that's usually research and not necessarily assessment. And so how would we sort of edit all of that for assessment? And a lot of it still stands. It's just a little bit more thinking about who is the audience you're trying to reach, and is that audience even reading that journal article, right? For a long time, coming out of my master's program, the only journal worth anything is JCSD, right? Because that's who I had as faculty. And they do have this section. I haven't read JCSD in a very long time, but they do have a section, Research in Brief, and their explanation of that is, in part, they're looking for campus-based interventions. So in theory, one might think that they're talking about assessment that's been approved to be research. But I think sort of the experience for me, that was, assessment even might be a stretch for it, that really made me feel like publishing was like an avenue that I actually had like the capability to explore, was ACUI's The Bulletin. and getting on the ACUI research program team and missing someone else sort of missed the deadline for getting in, the renovated space showcase. And that was, unacceptable. So Sophie, as the assessment person, needed to reach out and say, how can we still get our renovation in? They're like, well, just write an article about it. Like, we're always looking for research articles. I'm like, you're always looking for research articles? Research being a relative term. And just that, like, sort of realization for me, that even though we're socialized to think of everything as research, to think of everything as the peer-reviewed article space, there are other publication avenues that are better situated for the audience you might be trying to reach, like other professionals in your functional area, that actually don't get a lot of submissions, that would be happy for you to submit something of high quality. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah. I think then, like, talking about assessment, kind of publishing assessment, and it might be those research journals, it might not be those traditional journals, it might be a blog, it could be a book or a book chapter. One of the things then, like we have me talking about, is conceptual thinking. But I do want to circle back on something Sophie just said, which highlights, like, when we think about research, right, this idea that I have to have this fully formulated manuscript. And then that fully formulated manuscript, right, some of the advice that's been given, which is good advice, is to look at that journal and how they write it, and then write something similar, and then submit the whole thing. And then that's what gets, again, not graded, but it's hard, like, that gets the feedback, but it's fully written. That style I've always been intimidated by personally. It just doesn't, like, that doesn't feel good to me. And I've heard other folks say this, to say, like, I really appreciate writing for a book chapter because I have a little bit more room, they feel like, in a book chapter, to say what they want to say. Or, whether you do a book chapter, or maybe you want to do a blog post, and some journals, like JSI does this, you submit the idea. You're like, is this even an idea that you would take before I invest my life and my weekends to hope that you're going to accept it? Like, I don't want to miss that time with my family and kids to get a rejection on a thing. Do you, like, that seems like a waste of time to me. It is just not my style. So I like a book chapter idea, or writing in a blog and submitting that to somebody that's like, yeah, this idea really sounds good. And you'll see some research journals, I forget what it's called, so somebody that's smarter than me, please say it, but like, where you submit your research idea, but you actually don't have your results yet, right? So there's research journals that are moving in a similar direction, because that will help us as a field not just publish the things that show change or show difference. We need things that show us, hey, we might be doing this intervention and we're finding there's no change. And that's informative too, right? So that might be something to think about, is kind of the entry and the commitment at the start. But I've used that for, I think, where we kind of talk about conceptual thinking pieces, just how do we think differently as a field or in our work, and depending on who that is, and again, like Sophie said, who your audience is and where they might be reading, how much you want to say in a conceptual thinking piece. Like, I've seen great blog posts that have some conceptual thinking, but maybe not a big lit review on that, right? It's just kind of like, here's what I think. And, I've written conceptual thinking pieces that I've tried to, like, I don't know, cement into, like, grounding it into the literature and what people have said and done before, because I might feel like what I'm saying is, like, in left field. And so I want that to be like somebody to really understand why I got somewhere, or why I'm thinking this way and what's influenced that. So I write a conceptual piece that's heavily grounded in the work that's been done before me. And so I think, those are things to think about too, when you think about both conceptual thinking pieces that you might want to do, and thinking about where you might, like, submit, and how that kind of entry point might help you make a choice too.
I think everyone brought up great comments, and also we get ideas where we can publish. I want to add one more thing, which is very important, is if you start submitting, whether it's to a book chapter or a journal article, you can be rejected. It's okay. I've been rejected, and I actually saw in a way rejection is nice because, for example, if I went to a peer-reviewed journal, you usually get feedback. Sometimes you get a little bit of feedback, but if you're very lucky, you get the whole piece back and a lot of feedback. So I found, okay, this rejection is not the end of the world. Rather, it's a good critique, so you can go and submit your piece again. Or, for example, you wanted to submit it as one piece. Let's say a book chapter didn't work out. You can maybe do it as a blog. So just letting you know the rejection is completely fine. And it actually is benefit because often you get critique to make your work even better. I want to now move on to our final part of the presentation before the Q&A, excuse me, and that's the personal practices. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues to talk about personal practices for a publication.
You mentioned one earlier, Ania, I think Sophie, you did too, about like early morning time or whatever. My non-academic way to describe one I did was you have a to-do list. That's really important, but I categorize it as a dumb list and a smart list. So whatever your times that you're feeling smart, that you make sure you do something smart, like a really important key paragraph that you need to write. But if you're feeling not so smart, you don't have a lot of time, you're exhausted, you can format a table, right? Like you can do something to feel, you can check a reference, right? Update a citation. That was a really helpful way to me. I would be procrastinating and want to do like dumb things when I actually had a good chunk of time to try something smart. So that helped me get through things like a dissertation.
I'm not quite sure where this recommendation could have gone in the sort of prior section, but I I think one of the best things that you can probably do if you want to start writing, but you're not necessarily sure where to start, is to get involved in SAAL, in NASPA, in ACPA. I remember a while ago, probably 15 years, someone explained book chapters to me as just a popularity contest. Book chapters are more about who you know than what your idea is. I don't know how true that is, but for the chapter I have written and the chapter I am writing, I would say that that's absolutely true for both of them. Doesn't feel like anything I brought to the project or any idea I had was what got me into that book. It was more about the sponsorship of the person I was collaborating with, and who was trying to put together the chapter proposal. So get involved, get connected, and good things will come from it.
I'm like thinking about what you just said, Sophie. I feel like we could go lots of places with it, but I'll try to stay on point here. Yeah, I think for me, I always still am way more comfortable presenting than I am with writing. And so for me, when I think about writing, I try to come up with the outline and I try to visually think about talking to a group of people about it. And is this how I would order how I'm going to talk to that group of people about it? And then I'll start writing through that and doing different sections. And then for me, I think I'm just more visual and conceptual. I sketch it out into PowerPoint slides. Again, is this how I would do it? And it's really easy for me to move the PowerPoint slides then. If I'm like, oh, what if this went here? Would that flow a little better for me? For whatever reason, I do better in the PowerPoint than I do in Word. And so then I might tweak it there. And then I go to Word and I'm, adjusting it there again. So I do that. I also will have use my screen reader on my phone to read it to me. And I want to hear, can I follow audio on what I just wrote? And if I get tripped up somewhere listening, then I'm like, oh, Mark, I'll write that down because I'll be walking somewhere and I'll go back and work on editing that. Because if Siri's tripping up on that, then somebody else is going to trip up on that reading it. So those are some things that I do because I find writing to be difficult and lean into other strengths I have to figure out how to do it.
I want to close this section of maybe adding a few things. The first thing I think I want to add is that writing is not, I would say for most folks, a one and done thing. Rather, you have to go and you can write, then you step away and you come back. If during the process you can talk it through with colleagues or have somebody else to read it, I would say that's even better. I think one of the mistakes I made when I started publishing, thinking it was only Ania who could do it, but then I realized it's kind of a team effort. For example, Shaun talked about co-authors, or maybe you can be part of a writing group. I know Darby put a writing group for NASPA, AERKC. That's an option as well. So just letting you know that you have the support and that writing doesn't have to be a solitary activity. Before we turn to Q&A, I know we have a few minutes. Is there any last minute thoughts from any of my colleagues?
Go ahead, Sophie.
I was just gonna, I think one of the questions in the chat is sort of relevant to what we're talking about now in terms of the like speech to text. I have an hour-long drive, and so I have a pinned team to myself. We're a Microsoft Teams campus, and so I'll often dictate to myself while I'm driving of just like, I don't necessarily use it for like writing paragraphs, although I should. But it's more things I want to look into, or like as I'm mulling over things while I'm driving, my brain kind of needs that like secondary thing to focus on. I can't listen to a podcast and like watch the podcast. I have to be driving. And so it helps my brain to try to do that while I'm driving, and just that's how I use that functionality. And then when I'm back at my computer, I'll just copy and paste that into the Word document or group document that I'm working in.
I feel like I use that tip, Sophie. Sophia said, like, we just needed to record that conversation and everything you just said. And like, that needs to be written. And I'm like, oh, that's like a great idea because I'm better at that. Right. And so picking up on those tidbits from friends. So I've used that. Thank you.
I've not used that, but I do want to point out stream of consciousness and how important that is, and different from the polished writing. And I've had times where I polish and I don't keep good notes of how I got there, and then later I forget how I got there, and I'm trying to remember why I wrote something the way I did. So having some sort of diary separate from the product of what you did, it's like a clipboard too. Like you write a really good paragraph, you trim it, but don't delete it, right? You wrote something really like save it in the clipboard. Really helpful too when you're collaborating with others, that you're keeping a running log of what you might still want to include in the flow that you're trying to go for, the purpose, all the things that don't make the final cut but are important context.
And if you haven't read Anne Lamott, Bird by Bird, I try to read it like every 5 years. And if you haven't read Anne Lamott, apologies. She's very irreverent, but like shitty first draft. And that's something that I tell my friends often, right? The stream of consciousness is really important. The shitty first draft is really important. And it's an excellent read. I highly recommend. Yeah.
And maybe the last one, because this is or not last, but one that I'll say is I think, Ania mentioned getting like, folks, to read, and we might think getting people that know what you're talking about to read. And yeah, I've gotten folks that don't know what I'm talking about to read. I actually want it to land. Maybe my most favorite compliment was when my mom, who is not in education and in higher education, I could get emotional, read my first article about the multi-level assessment process, and it made sense to her. And she's in like the financial sector and saw ways that could, she could think about that for her work. And so getting folks that are outside of our bubble and outside of the language, somebody once told me, marry somebody that calls it a dorm. It's kind of like the same concept, like, get somebody that doesn't speak your language, and does it make sense to them, and where did they get tripped up, right? And that can help because there's all kinds of folks that are going to read our articles that know and that don't know, and we want to make sure it's accessible for whatever place somebody might be coming in.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your great thoughts. We're actually at 2:40 where we wanted to end at, so we're going to turn it over now to Q&A. Great job, team. We did it.
Awesome. Thanks to our wonderful panelists. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And then I